and then rapid fire. I'm moving to your first question, which was,
what are they going to attack you as?
oh yeah, I don't know what they'll. I'm open-minded. I mean, the brown face of white supremacy, right? I've heard some rumblings of that, right?
And that's what we're going.
I mean, I've heard it already. It's rumbling up. I don't pay much heed to that, because I think that once they've resorted to those kinds of attacks, that's when you're right over the target, and I'm staying right over the target.
Welcome back to the Futures Edge podcast. I'm Jim Uriel. As always, the brains behind the operation, co-host and executive producer, Bob Icino. Today, we have a special guest, Vivek Ramaswamy. You've probably heard of him. He's one of the leading candidates for the GOP nomination. There's a couple things I'm going to say before we start. Okay, if you give to candidates, it's not always because you are sworn to them and you're giving them your firstborn. We give to candidates to get them on the debate stage. So whether there's things you agree with or disagree with from Vivek's policy, if you think that he deserves to be in the conversation, even if it's going to sway your conversation, then give to his campaign. We'll get him on the stage. We'll call those other people to answer these questions. I like most of the things that Vivek says, and I haven't even necessarily decided who I'm going to vote for yet. I just love the things he's saying. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, Vivek.
My pleasure, guys. It's good to be on. I love the way you guys do things lighthearted, and I love the way you explain that too, because people get too obsessed over the question of the who. Forget the who for a while. That's for next year, right?
Yeah,
we want to ask the question of the what and the why. Nobody's casting votes in the presidential primary this year. This year is about define what do we stand for, why do we stand for it, get the thoughtful people, hopefully myself included, on the debate stage. And so I tell people, give $1, give $5. It doesn't matter. That actually helps the cause and the movement. So that's actually honest. I'm going to be really honest with you guys. That's one of my goals for everybody listening to this podcast is, even if it's $1 or $5, go to Vivek2024.com, decide who you vote for next year, but populate the debate stage with the best ideas you can this year. So that's part of the goal, actually.
And that's good. We're transparent. That's what we're doing. We're telling people exactly what we're going for, and people seem to like that. But before we can go, we're going to ask you a couple questions, non-related to markets, non-related to policy, and you will be judged harshly on your answers. Who's your favorite band, first off?
Favorite band? I would say it's a good question. I have a favorite musical artist. Can I give you that?
Sure.
Eminem, I would say, actually.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. We've never had someone say Eminem. Your favorite sports team that you root for. And if you say any Premier League team, we'll have to cut your mic and this interview's over. It's gotta be one of our sports here. What do you got?
Oh, Bengals. I mean, it was like an easy answer. I mean, I'm a struggling Bengals. I'm born and raised Cincinnati, so it's since I was like 4, but yeah.
So you've earned your stripes. Yeah.
So to speak.
I'm a huge Bears fan, but I love Joe, man. Joe is so good.
Joe's best.
He's so good, but so actually, I'd never been to the Super Bowl. It was always a dream that the Bengals would make it to the Super Bowl and that I would go. So last year when the Bengals made it to the Super Bowl, me and my brother, we live in different places. We met up. We said, we're doing this. They were up till the very end.
Oh, that was
and then last 3 minutes. So it's a tough life being a Bengals fan.
Horrible call.
It's kind of rough, but anyway, you can't complain.
But he's just so cool. I remember the end of one of the games this year, and that he needed to make a pass into a window like this, and just looking at his face is like, of course I'll make it. I'm freaking Joe Burrow. Boom.
And nailed it.
I thought it was really cool. Yeah, he nailed it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, let's get on to some more serious things too. Like I said before, Bobby's an oil analyst and trader from way back. I am a Fed watcher, currencies, bonds. We like to look at policy. There's some things you said that we have some questions on. Now I'm going to start with the relationship with China. You have advocated for essentially cutting ties with China. I will argue that over the last 30, 40 years, our relationship with China and our access to inexpensive labor has afforded us a certain lifestyle here. Are you saying to the American people that if we break ties and relocate all our supply chains, we have to deal with some pain? We have to step back in lifestyle, or do you have a plan?
Yeah, so I've a detailed vision on this, and I'm glad you're getting right into the thick of it and asking, I think, the right question. So I agree with what you said. I think we have been afforded conveniences in this country over the last 50 years. That was part of the bargain of getting cheap stuff effectively that allowed us to power our economy and have conveniences we otherwise wouldn't have enjoyed. However, that was part of China's plan. So if you rewind back to when Henry Kissinger opened up relations with China and you said, hey, I'm going to fast forward 50 years and China's going to be in a mutually codependent relationship with the US as sort of a codependent bipolar relationship of global power, the US would have laughed, said that was a crazy, laughable idea. That would never happen. And if it did, we wouldn't have entered that bargain. And China would have said that's a best case scenario, but that's what we're shooting for. Guess where we are today? That's exactly or almost exactly where we are. I think that's a problem. It's one thing if China was a country that didn't, that shared a US objective of having true global free markets and wanted to flourish together on this planet. That's not the Chinese objective. They're playing according to a 1,000-year plan. They're buying up land in the United States. We're fast forward 500 years. See a bunch of Americans as a bunch of Chinese serfs. That's the long range plan that they're headed to. And they see the last 400 years as an aberration in human history. So you got to understand that arc. So here's what I say though. We have an opportunity we can seize on right now. Okay. And that opportunity is that Xi Jinping shot China itself in the foot last year when he took over his unprecedented third term. He broke the chain of succession. Normally it's 2 5-year terms. He took over a third term, but he did a lot of damage to the Chinese economy in the process. So here's where I'm at. I think there's an opportunity for us to declare economic independence from China. It's not as hard as it sounds. If you think that you have to bring all of that to the US, then yeah, that's hard. That's going to involve some real pain. But if it's not about just onshoring to the US, but it's about just declaring independence from China, there's 2 observations I'm going to make. The first is it's not as hard as some people think. If you're willing to use Japan, South Korea, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, Philippines, Brazil, Western Europe, West Africa to fill the gap, that actually becomes a lot easier. But the second point is because China's in that weak position, if we make the condition for China to say, we're going to separate unless you reform your behaviors, that you actually behave as a capitalist actor rather than a mercantilist actor. And I can say what that means, but that effectively makes companies into pawns for advancing their agenda. You know what China's going to say because they're in a weak spot? It's a lot tougher for them than it is for us to make that trade-off. I predict we'll have radical reform. And this is the number one principle. I had success in business, but the same thing applies in geopolitics here. It's when you're most willing to make a sacrifice that you won't have to make one at all. That's a classic principle of negotiation. That's the principle I'm bringing in here. But we need that fortitude. We need to man up a little bit, right? It's more Churchill and not Chamberlain. That'd be the best analogy I could give you, to use a British history analogy. That's what I'm bringing to the White House. And I understand how that's done, not as some career politician, but as somebody who actually knows to get these things done. That's the actual vision that I have. I don't want people in this country to have to make a sacrifice if we don't have to. But believe me, we're going to have to make a sacrifice if we march down this long road without changing course. And that's something that neither political party's embraced, but it takes an outsider to actually bring that wisdom, I think, to the White House.
Love it. You're muted, Bobby.
I do that all the time.
I have my dog barking in the background, so I muted so that it wouldn't interrupt your speech.
Real professional.
Real professional.
I love that.
I'll tell you, sometimes shit just gets, anyway. So as a follow-up to what Jimmy said and kind of addressing what you said, I watched an interview you did with Megyn Kelly, and you talked very forcefully about Taiwan. So you brought up Kissinger, and then you brought up Churchill and Chamberlain, and we're all of the age where we've at least gotten a little bit of that history. And I know Jimmy's a history buff, and I am as well. So we know quite a bit more about it than people who are maybe 30 or 28 or 25. Inherent in your biotech success is some knowledge of technology. How do you actually, from your podium, get people to look back and say, okay, Vivek said this started with Kissinger, and we want to be more Churchill and not Chamberlain. How do you get people with the attention span this big to actually pay attention to that part and possibly be willing to contribute to that? And as a follow-up, how much do we actually protect and invest in Taiwan being independent now versus us going to Japan, South Korea, and the rest?
Yeah, so deep question on number 2. On number 1, to be really honest with you, it's through forums like this one. I mean, look, you guys are smart guys. You hounded me down to find me on Twitter, but I respect the tenacity. But I said, but I also took a look at you. I said, these are smart, thoughtful guys. My candidacy, listen up. I'm not going to follow what the political consultant class tells me to do. The classic advice that I hear from them, and I understand where they're coming from, is they say, dumb it down. I'm not going to do that. I trust the American electorate, right? I actually trust a lot of the conservative movement, even people, in the outside of the historical political norms in the MAGA movement, America First movement. A lot of intellectually curious people. You don't have to have gone to college necessarily to be intellectually curious, but I think we actually have a more intellectually curious, intelligent electorate than most professional politicians give them credit for. Now, social media destroys that a little bit. I think even modern television media destroys that a little bit by only serving up sound bites. But I think people are hungry for more than that. So I'll tell you this is I would rather A, speak truth at every step, and B, do it with nuance and do it unapologetically at every step and lose this election than I would to win this election by playing some sort of focus group political snakes and ladders for something that's designed to be poll-tested platitudes. We'll figure out how the system works. I'm an outsider. I don't know how it works, but my bet is that this will actually be more successful. And you know what? If I'm wrong, guess what? I'll fall flat on my face, and I'm okay with that because I'm going to be me, and I'd rather do that through this process than to try to follow some political consultant's formula as to how you're supposed to win elections. I don't believe in that anyway, but if they're right, fine. Let that person win. I'm still going to do this my way. That's kind of the way I'm approaching.
Right. And that's why we hunted you down, because that's the message we get from you. And that's the message that we really like. I'd like to flip a little bit to energy policy too. We handle energy policy on this show quite a bit. We've had some of the leading energy policy experts in the world. We've made some tremendous mistakes. Mike Wirth, the CEO of Chevron, in a speech last year said that he doesn't believe another refinery will ever be built in this country due to onerous regulation, due to almost punitive regulation, it seems. This to me seems one of like the most asinine moves we've ever done is to blow up the bridge that is fossil fuels before we have the bridge that is renewables built. How are you going to address that? What are you going to do?
Yeah, so I'll address this, and I'm happy to take the Taiwan question that I didn't get to also, but this is so important.
I'm so sorry. I interrupted. No, you can answer whatever question you want.
We'll do the energy, and then we'll come back. We'll kick it back to Taiwan because you guys are right over the flame, hitting the good stuff here. I like that. So here's what I say on the energy piece of this. We have shot our own selves in the foot when it comes to fossil fuel production in the United States. And I'm going to say some things that you're not supposed to say right now, but you know what we're going to do? I'm going to lead this country in a way where we unleash the American economy. You want to know how? By unleashing American energy. You want to know how we unleash American energy? Drill, frack, burn coal, do it without apologizing. And I personally believe that even this idea of the energy transition is itself a falsehood. I think it is a myth that there is an energy transition ongoing. First of all, let's look at the facts. It isn't happening. 24/7 backup for wind and solar through an electric power grid. How do you power that? Fossil fuels. But it's not even a desirable transition, actually. So we can go into depth on this, but 8 times more people in this country, in this world, die of cold temperatures rather than warm ones. The planet is greener than it has ever been, in part because carbon is plant food, in part because of slightly warmer surface temperatures. 50 years ago in this country, the same people who were worrying about climate change were worried about it. The cover of Time magazine or Newsweek, you want to tell some of those people who are 28 years old you were talking about earlier, open up, I think it was the 1973 cover of Time magazine and Newsweek.
79.
They were warning of an ice age in this country. So this is, and we could just go into depth. We could spend hours on this alone. But I reject the anti-impact framework itself, the anti-carbon framework. I think we should be proud in this country that we live a high-carbon lifestyle. You know who doesn't? Ethiopia and Somalia. And there's a reason that actually we have seen the progress we have while they haven't. Fossil fuels are a crucial part of the story. And then there's this mystery where the very opponents to fossil fuels are also, mystifyingly, opponents to the greatest form and most abundant and renewable form of carbon-free energy production known to mankind, that is nuclear energy. So what's going on there? I think that this climate cult has nothing to do with the climate. It actually has to do with punishing the West, and America in particular, for our success and our modern way of life. And that's why they apply the constraints here without applying them to places like China. China's laughing at every step of the way as they make their way to the top, assuming developing nation status. I'm not making this up. developing nation status in the climate negotiations, this is a ruse. It is a hoax. I'm not saying that climate change doesn't exist. In some measure, it does. It's also existed as long as humankind has existed. And the man-made form of it, yes, there's some component to it, but it's not an existential threat. And the right answer is actually to address it through adaptation and through mastery of that, through advances in technology powered by fossil fuels. And that's why we have a 98% reduction. The fact I'm about to share, not contested. None of the facts I've shared are contested. 98% reduction in the climate-related disaster death rate in the last century, driven by, you guessed it, innovation powered by fossil fuels. So I'm a US president, if I'm elected, who doesn't apologize for these realities, even like other Republicans who'll dance around this issue and talk about time horizons of the transition. I say the anti-impact framework itself is a false premise, and we need to go in a different direction that embraces human flourishing. Let's measure those death rates. Let's measure life expectancy. Let's measure human actual value and health rather than carbon as an end in itself. That's a false measurement system when we should measure the thing we care about: human prosperity, human flourishing. That's what I care about. And you know what? It's almost as though we don't talk about GDP growth in this country anymore. Republicans will talk about cutting Social Security and Medicare. Democrats will talk about tax increases to fight the debt. How about GDP growth itself? And you know what's fundamental to GDP growth is unleashing the American energy sector itself. So you nailed it.
So I want to go back to Taiwan. I really do, because I want to hear your stance on that. But now I want to shift to banking if we could, because you criticized Governor Ron DeSantis. He's my governor here. And I've gone on record as saying I don't want him to run because I like him here. Also, I'm much more afraid of the cold than the warmth, which is why I remember the cover was 1979, because I was in my room crying for a week thinking there was going to be an ice age. There was a clip going around, and it was with Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Yellen. Our guest last week, Dr. Kamal Shri Kumar, was great, super intelligent, interest rate guy, called her Monday Yellen, Tuesday Yellen, Wednesday Yellen, because she changes every couple of days of the week.
Sounds about right.
He was asked by, I think it was Omaha Senator, Nebraska Senator? Oklahoma, Langford. He asked her about why they made SVP critical to the banking system, SVB rather, Silicon Valley Bank, and why Signature Bank just made it across the wire. And here was her answer. A bank gets the treatment if a supermajority of the FDIC board and a supermajority of the Fed board, and I, in consultation with the president, determine that the failure to protect uninsured depositors would create systematic risk. That made me so angry that basically these people, none of which we elected except the president, her in consultation with the president, would decide when people's deposits were protected and when they were not. And she went on to tell Senator Langford that the depositors in Oklahoma community banks would not be protected. Where did you come down on that? Because I didn't see where you fell on that, the bailout of SVB and Signature. I didn't see that.
Oh, I was the earliest critic of it, actually. I wrote on the pages of the Wall Street Journal and I wrote it up. They published it instantly after I sent it in, arguing against the bailout of Silicon Valley. And it was a bailout of Silicon Valley itself. It wasn't technically a bailout of Silicon Valley Bank because the bank's own shareholders were wiped out, but it was a bailout of all the depositors there who for years, as part of that Silicon Valley community, had said that, oh, no, they don't need to be regulated in the same way as other banks because it's small and not systemically important. And then in their hour of need, Janet Yellen, goddess from above, deems it, because she was lobbied to, as systemically important so they could get bailed out. This is a travesty. This is crony capitalism. I don't even call it crony capitalism. I call it cronyism because there's nothing about it that actually has anything to do with capitalism. Capitalism
right out there in the
risk.
open. Right out there in the open. And this is why I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you for a good reason. Donate to Vivek's campaign. And we'll put the link up here multiple times. Because what happened to Tulsi Gabbard was a travesty, and it can't happen to you. Please continue, because
they tried to do it to Tulsi. They tried to do it to Bernie Sanders. So honestly, if people go to Vivek2024.com, Vivek2024.com, that's the website, give $1, give $5, get me a prominent spot on the debate stage. Because actually a lot of the donor class in the Republican Party didn't like this, my position on this either.
Right.
And that's why other Republicans aren't talking about it. They're hiding from it. including Ron DeSantis, who, by the way, I think is a great governor too. I also think his best role right now is as a governor. The question of who you need in the White House, I think we need an outsider in the White House. I don't think it can be a professional politician this time around, and I can tell you why. He's a great governor, and I think that I want him to continue doing a great job in your state. But I think that the thing that went wrong here was that Silicon Valley got its bread buttered in a way that an oil and gas bank in the middle of Oklahoma wouldn't have, because it's part of the favored class. And a lot of the virtue signaling that you see, the ESGism, the corporate wokeism, that's just like a down payment. It's like an insurance payment such that you get bailed out in your hour of need. That's what happened to Silicon Valley here. And there's something fundamentally corrupt about that, with these gods and goddesses on high, like Janet Yellen, picking favorites. That's not capitalism. And in the guise of capitalism, they justify really this form of, it's a kind of fascism, a merger of state power and corporate power that together is more powerful than either one alone. And the biggest illusion, this isn't even a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's really not. I think there were Republicans and Democrats both who were quietly against it, but didn't want to say so because their donors, Silicon Valley donates to both sides, didn't want them to say it. So it's like a puppet master pulling its puppet's strings. The people who we elect to run the government are not the ones who actually run the government. So I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, or independent. Join me in at least having a dream as a citizen of this country that has a fantasy, that the idea that the people who we elect, whoever they are, maybe I agree with them, maybe I don't, but the people who we elect to run the government are the ones who actually run the government. That is not the case today. And that's what we need to restore: integrity to our republic, integrity to our system of self-governance. That is what we're missing today. And if we can restore that, then at least then we can reunite a country where everyone believes that even if it's not my guy, it's at least the guy who we elected who makes the decisions, as opposed to what we have today is it's a permanent state, a managerial bureaucracy that views the elected officials, including the president, as a cute little inconvenience that'll pass like a passing storm every 4 or 8 years. It's really the permanent state that runs the show. That's going to change under my watch. And that's why it has to be an outsider. Donald Trump got as close as anyone was going to get. He didn't go the distance, though. And I'm taking that America First agenda to the next level, but it's going to have to be an outsider to do it. And that's a big part of why I'm in this race.
So I know exactly what your opinion is on central bank digital currencies. I think it's an enormous deal. Bobby and I are both, we would probably describe ourselves as libertarian more than we would Republican any day of the week. The people who you are running against, people who are running for president, I haven't heard a lot of comments from them. Are they too stupid to understand the dangers of it? Or do they not care? Or do they genuinely want the power over everyone like that will convey?
I think on much of the Democratic Party, I think it's that they genuinely want the power. I mean, Elizabeth Warren is a proponent of central bank digital currencies for a reason. But on the Republican side, it's mostly that they don't care. And here's the thing about Republicans is they only get trained on an issue. It's like Twitter trains Republicans. Who trains Republican candidates? Twitter does. If it doesn't trend on Twitter, they don't care. That's basically how it works. And I think Republican politicians, you think a lot about the effect of AI on human beings, right? We're worried about AI. AI is already causing human beings to behave differently in the world than they otherwise would have behaved, because the algorithms of social media determine what even the way we talk to each other in the real world offline. It definitely determines the way Republican politicians talk to their base. And so central bank digital currencies has too many syllables in it to say out loud, and CBDC becomes an acronym that they don't know what it means. They just don't care enough about the issue. This is where the action is, though. The financial weaponization, the weaponization of the financial system. ESG is one frontier, but CBDCs hardwire that into the currency itself, gives the government the control to actually implement a social credit system that China's implementing for a reason. One of the justifications you hear in places like the UK for adopting CBDCs is that China's doing it. Think about it, folks. Why is China doing it? They're doing it because they want to use the financial system to implement a social credit scoring system where they can just deduct money out of your bank account if you say something or do something in your private life that the government doesn't like. We're laying the groundwork for that by entertaining that possibility in the US. Even if the people who are doing it, some of them might have those sinister intentions, but the rest of them just view it as a boring issue, that a technocratic issue. When those of us who actually understand what's going on, myself included, have to have a responsibility to educate the public and highlight and lead in a way that says a hard no, absolutely not. We will not let that happen in this country. That won't make the dollar weaker. That's the argument they make, is that we have to keep up with the Joneses, keep up with China, keep up with the Jinpings, I should say. That's the Chinese mentality. That's the American mentality with respect to China. We should actually say, no, we're not keeping up with the Joneses. We're not keeping up with the Jinpings. We're doing it our way. And that should actually make the dollar more desirable, which should actually preserve a stronger dollar over the long run, but even more importantly, preserve liberty in this country. And I think it takes a president in the White House who has a first personal understanding of these issues, doesn't just study the briefing book given to them by a member of that permanent state, which is part of the technocratic problem. It's not even a Republican or Democrat thing. It's a question of whether or not you're part of that managerial bureaucracy that wants to use this technocratic system of control. Many members of that managerial bureaucracy, even Republicans, favor central bank digital currencies. And I think it's why it's important to have a president who won't fall for that trick. And you better believe it. It's not an issue in the Republican Party today. If I'm on that debate stage, and I expect to be, but need a prominent spot on that debate stage, we will be forcing these issues such that the other candidates can't hide from it, which is where that small dollar uprising actually helps make that happen with the movement we've already built at Vivek2024.com.
And that again is the reason that we wanted to have you on, is this is not necessarily us trying to support your candidacy more than it is us trying to get you on the stage, because you need to be able to say these things in front of the American public. I will tell you that I have no idea who I'm supporting at this point, but I'm supporting your effort is in the strongest possible terms. I donated, by the way, to get you on that stage. You need to be on that stage, which brings me back to Taiwan, if I could. Can you answer the Taiwan question? How important is Taiwan? Yep. And also, could you then go into your view on TikTok and if there's any danger there?
Oh, yes. So great questions. You guys are, this is good stuff, okay? Because
we're on it.
Yeah, you're on it. You're on the case. So Taiwan. All right. So Taiwan is fundamentally different than Ukraine, in my view. I don't think we should be spending more American resources on Ukraine. A lot of people don't like it when I say that. I think that's just where I'm at. Taiwan's different because it's tied to an actual American interest, which is unfortunately the position we've put ourselves in, is that we're reliant on this tiny island nation off the southeast coast of China for our entire modern way of life, right? The phones in our pockets, right? The refrigerator that kept that bottle of water cold before I drink it. All of these are powered by semiconductors, okay? These are these small chips that we source, if the advanced kind, certainly come from this island nation. Now, how we got here, that's an embarrassment that we ever put ourselves in this position, but we are where we are. That was part of that Kissinger project dating back 50 years ago. All that said, China wants Taiwan for two reasons. One is it's a project of what they will call reunification, their word, not mine, but to address an issue dating back to 1949 when Chiang Kai-shek fled, but he was supposed to be the opposition to Mao Zedong. This is part of a rebellion against China itself. That's one reason, is it's sort of an ego-driven reason, a nationalistic reason that Xi Jinping has in mind. But the second reason is it's their ticket to the big grand bargain they want to get to, consummating that 50-year vision that they had, to say that what they really want with the United States is they want to be in co-equal status. And the deal they want to strike, if you want to ask me, and I have a pretty strong view on this, and I think it's grounded, you can believe me or not, I think I'm pretty darn right about this. They want the trade which says, we will make your stuff if you guys give us your IP. That's what China wants. We get the US IP, but we'll make your stuff in return. They don't want to go to war. They may be willing to, but they don't want to go to war. We don't want to go to war. That's the trade they want. That's the big grand bargain, because then we're in this co-equal relationship for centuries to come. That would have been laughable 50 years ago, but they're within striking distance of getting there. And Taiwan is one of their tickets to potentially do it, because right now, if they come to that deal to the US, that doesn't make sense for us, right? Because we can still get our stuff made somewhere else, but our IP and our technological leadership, that's unique to the US. But if they have Taiwan and they're making our semiconductors, then they've got us in a chokehold. So that's why Taiwan's important for them. So here's the thing we can do in this country, is make sure that our semiconductor supply chain is actually secure, regardless of reliance on Taiwan. Once we get there, I don't think we have to have nearly as big of a military commitment to Taiwan. And that too will make a lot of people mad. But I think I'm just speaking truth here. It's in our self-interest in the meantime, until we've shored up our semiconductor supply chains, to make sure that China doesn't annex Taiwan. Now, you know, to really play the game theory out here. It may be that China, if their nationalistic reason for wanting to take over Taiwan is really part of what motivates Xi Jinping, and I think that's a big part of the story, they may quietly wait it out to let us restore that semiconductor supply chain, so at least they get to check the nationalistic box, even if it doesn't allow them to achieve parity with the US. So again, you need a president who thinks in 3D or more in playing this out, but that's the way to think about this, is that's what's going on here. And I think that, you know, there's other factors too, right? Because the US is decommissioning ships in the South China Sea. It's our divest to invest program. It doesn't make much sense, but it's what we're doing. That hits a nadir, a low point in like the 2027 timeframe. So that may be when China goes for it. So that's our window to shore up our semiconductor supply chains in this country. I'll be really honest with you. Most Democrats, and frankly, I don't mean to neg them, but most of the Republicans in this presidential field, they don't understand this stuff at nearly the level I'm talking about here. They come back to talking points as, oh, we must protect Ukraine. Okay, well, protect Ukraine. We must protect Taiwan. Yes, protect Taiwan. China bad. Okay, China bad. That's like their level of understanding of this. I'm not really, it's a little bit of a caricature, but not by much. That's where they're at on this. And so again, I want to be the next US president because I think we need a president who has a first personal conviction on these issues as an outsider and not a career politician. But at minimum, the next step is in August. That's the debate stage. And we need to force people to debate this with that nuance. And that's what I'm aiming to do with the small dollar donation campaign. Now you ask about TikTok. So look, I have an issue with, I think we can't conflate different issues here. TikTok is an example of a problem for kids. It's like a drug addiction problem for kids. So if we say you can't smoke an addictive cigarette by the age of 18, if we say you can't get a tattoo by the age of 18, if we say you can't have an addictive drink by the age of 21, we have no business letting 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds use addictive social media like TikTok. That's not limited to TikTok. So that's where I think the issue is most pertinent, is when it relates to kids. I'm against this other thing going on, though, this Restrict Act, which is using TikTok as an excuse to expand our national security state, which I think cannot be trusted, has demonstrated itself to be unworthy of trust. And again, deflection, that's what the masters in the federal government, especially the bureaucrats, are masters at. Don't fall for that trick. So even though I'm really cautious against China and against TikTok and other things against kids and complain about the way the Chinese government uses that to extract data, don't let our own government play a trick to create Patriot Act 2.0 with this so-called Restrict Act. And so I believe on principles. You know, I believe in principles, not in talking points. And that's why I'm pretty clear about drawing those distinctions.
You know, we were on foreign policy, which I love that. We had Valina Chekarova, who runs a global policy consultancy, and she was talking about the Russia versus Ukraine situation. And she almost convinced me that it's Russia's fault completely and we play no part in this. Then I keep looking at the fact that NATO was essentially, the only reason it was formed was to oppose Russia. And then all of a sudden we start expanding it to different spots, which I can obviously see how that's perceived as a threat to Russia. How do you weigh in on this whole thing?
I lost you for about 2 seconds there.
Okay, so Russia versus Ukraine,
yep.
Expansion of NATO, obviously could be viewed as a threat if you were the Russian president.
Right.
Whose fault is this, and why are we marching towards this conflict?
So here's the way I look at it in geopolitics. If you're leading the United States, like in a criminal trial of a defendant and a prosecutor or whatever, there I ask the question of whose fault. In the question of geopolitics, if I'm leading this country, I ask one question: what is in the American national interest? Let's be very blunt about it. I think every nation asks that question. We have to ask the question, what's in the American national interest? So here's my view, okay? I think there's a lot of complexities in Europe's security situation. That's up to Europe to address it first. So I don't think the United States has a national interest in spending more resources in getting Ukraine to defeat Russia, so Russia's then deterred from going after a NATO country. But I do think the United States has put 40,000 troops in Germany, which I think is a questionable decision, which Germany then tells Poland, a U.S. ally, that Poland can't, because of export controls of one part in the fighter jets, send fighter jets to Ukraine. I have no problem with Poland defending its own border by sending fighter jets to Ukraine, because Poland can absolutely adopt a Poland first policy, just as the U.S. needs to adopt an America first policy. And I have no problem with Ukraine adopting a Ukraine first policy. That's the leader of Ukraine doing what he's supposed to do. But what we're not supposed to do is to bow to some sort of, I would say, when it comes to the U.S., the equivalent of a Pied Piper, a Hamlin, that's leading half of both members of both political parties to somehow adopt a Ukraine first agenda. I drive home sometimes and I'll see somebody who has a Ukraine flag in their front yard, but not an American one. It's not even like they have an American flag. It's bizarre. And so I'm in favor of reviving an America first culture, both in our country, but also in leadership. And it's not a Republican or Democrat issue. And by the way, it's not a Donald Trump issue. America first is bigger than one man. It's bigger than Donald Trump. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than the Republican Party. I think we can unite this country around that. But that's the way I look at it, is foreign policy that, yes, if I'm leading America, who would have ever thought, will put American interests first without apologizing for it. And I think that takes us out of this landscape of whose fault or what. That's the way we ask in questions of domestic justice, right? Criminal justice and otherwise. That's a different lens that you bring to foreign policy.
Vivek, you want to abolish the Department of Education. And
I do.
I can't find, and this kind of goes to, Jimmy put out, and I was glad he did this, he put out to all of our Twitter followers and all of our subscribers to send us questions. And there's so many of them I just can't ask you. And so we tried to keep the questions broad so that your answers to those questions would be in your responses to our questions. So I'm going to do something you don't like, which I'm going to dumb down a question that was sent out, not because you can't understand it, because it was sent in really too aggressive of a way, but I can't find the power within the presidency to abolish the Department of Education. So the apparatus that's running government now, tell me.
Great.
Okay, I'm done. Go.
Great question. Great question. I think I love people that get into the nuts and bolts of how you're going to do this. So there's a few different ways to do it. And I'm actually going to put out an article on this in the coming months. I believe the U.S. president does have that.
Send it to us when you do, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. The U.S. president does have that authority. I'll give you two ways to do it. The first is, we'll go with the mild version, which is what I'd like to do. Okay. So you asked a technical question, you get a technical answer. So the U.S., what happens right now is the administrative state, the departments, they make their budgeting requests directly to Congress, and then they get the budget requests back. It's supposed to be the executive branch asking Congress for permission to spend the money. Actually, the way Congress has grown to write those permission grants is that it says this department shall, that's the word they use, shall spend the money. And that's just become the new norm in Washington, is that the administrative agency makes the ask of Congress and then it comes back as shall spend. That's broken. I don't think there's two executive branches of government. I take the unitary view of the executive. There's one executive branch. That's what Article 2 of the Constitution says. So the way I'll run the presidency is all budget requests go through me, go through the White House, not directly from the Department of Education to Congress, but through the White House. When we get the authorization, it's going to be May, because we're asking for permission. That's the way the budget proposals go. That's what I expect from Congress coming back. That takes one objection down. The second thing is they say there's civil service protections. That gets to the civil service statutes. I actually read them in light of the presidential reorganization powers that Congress has also authorized. And the way you read that, I think actually a lot of these civil service protections don't apply if you're going to shut down a government agency, because you don't have a civil service protection to work for an agency that doesn't exist. So there's a lot of legal arguments here. And if those civil service protections are read so broadly, they're actually unconstitutional as measured against Article 2. I'll tell you, I'll give you the dumbed down version of this is, if somebody works for you and you can't fire them, that means they don't work for you. It means you work for them, because you're responsible for what they do without any authority to actually change it. I come into this as a CEO of successful companies that I've built beforehand. That's a private sector understanding of the Constitution. How's that for you? And I did have my, legal scholar background that's separate from that, but I'll bring a plain understanding there. So the short answer is that's a great question. I think it's actually more implementable than you'd imagine. But the reason other presidents get browbeaten out of taking steps like the ones I've proposed is that the standard Washington, D.C. swamp policy advisor answer is you can't do it. Actually, you can, but it takes a president with a bone-deep first personal constitutional conviction to actually bring that through. And that's what I'm bringing to the table. And again, that's something that I won't let the other candidates hide from. on the debate stage. I don't just want to be on the debate stage. Let's get to the center of it and actually force these issues in the Republican Party. I think that's going to be good for the country, good for the conservative movement, but more importantly, good for America as a whole if we're able to see those kinds of distinctions with clear eyes.
So you went with how you could get rid of the Department of Education. You didn't go with the why. I want to know the why.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm for getting rid of the Department of Education too, but I know that politicians are scared because they will soon paint you as being anti-education, which is the third rail. Why do you want to get rid of the Department of Education?
I want to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education because I'm pro-education, actually, in this country.
Awesome.
Pro-education where it takes place locally at the level of public schools that the federal government, in principle, should have nothing to do with, but actually meddles with anyway. So one thing they do is a lot of the rise of these woke agendas, racial woke agendas and radical gender ideologies. A lot of people have been focused on the school boards and for good reason. But here's the part they miss. Many of those schools and school boards are just responding to the economic incentives created by the federal Department of Education, which says you don't get these grants or get that money unless you adopt these toxic political progressive agendas. Now they also tip the scales towards four-year college education over two-year programs. So they subsidize a four-year gender studies major in California to be able to go, but then also load them up with debt without actually providing the incentives for people to pursue two-year education or even one-year vocational education to be a welder or carpenter or a builder or whatever. Well, we have a worker shortage in this country that leads to inflation. In part, that's because you get what you pay for. That's what the Department of Education pays for. $83 billion misspent in this way. I think you could take that $83 billion and fund underfunded school choice programs across this country. That's pro-education. That's pro-family. Families that actually have power over their kids' education. Oh, and by the way, take a tragic, school shooting like we had recently. This is a tragedy. You could put 2 to 3 armed security guards in every public school across this country for a less than a quarter of the budget of the U.S. Department of Education. That is staggering. You ask yourself, which is a better use of capital? You guys are money guys. Which is a better use of capital? It's not even close. And so that's the why. I've good command over the how, but everything is guided by that North Star of the why. And I think that if you're taking these steps on a moral foundation, on the basis of first principles, then you can actually go further than even Trump went with the America First agenda. And that's a big part of why I'm in this race. I do think it takes an outsider, but it takes an outsider who, we can preach about family values or God or faith in God or whatever we want to preach about as a conservative movement. And I believe in these things, but we have more moral authority to see it through if you have leaders who are actually operating according to first principles and moral authority themselves. It's not about just being morally sanctimonious. It's about actually having the conviction and the ability to go even further than we ever have with that America First agenda. That's what Reagan did in the 1980s. That's what I think we can do this time around. And that's a big part of why I'm in this race. Yes, an outsider, but who's operating according to principles and with moral conviction to go the distance.
So Vivek, unfortunately, I hate that you have a hard stop, but I have to rapid fire you a couple that our followers want us to ask. And also, I'm going to touch on a really good friend of mine who is now a Vivek supporter, just so you know, before I say this. He called Ron DeSantis Trump with political experience, okay? He called you Trump without the crazy. Now, he was a Trump supporter, just so you know. And he's a supporter of yours now. Number one, what do you think the media is going to attack you as? Number two, Second Amendment stance. And number three, taxes stance. Rapid fire.
Taxes was the last one?
Yeah.
Lower is better, period.
Yes.
I'm the pro-growth candidate. I think we can grow our way out of our problems. I think tax increases, even versus some spending cuts, that's small ball. Restore GDP growth in this country. The rest becomes a lot easier. Lowering taxes across the board, just like literally as low as you can get them, period. Flat tax if you can. I think that's actually the way to go. So that's with me on taxes. It's not a core part of my policy planks just because you got to pick your spots, but that's absolutely where I am in terms of my policy on it. So it's not something I'm going to pledge to do in the first 6 months. There's a lot else I've pledged to do. I'm very honest about that. But all else equal, more tax cuts, better economic growth. That's the North Star.
Very honest.
On the second question, Second Amendment question, unapologetic defender of the Second Amendment. Now, I'm going to say this is controversial, makes a lot of people uncomfortable when I say this, but it's just true. The Second Amendment was made for moments like these. that we live in. It's not about hunting and sports shooting. People make that mistake. No, it is the amendment that gives teeth to all the others. It's the second most important amendment. The First Amendment's the most important. The Second Amendment's the second most important. China and Iran nominally guarantee some of the rights we offer in our Bill of Rights. Well, they don't actually see them through because they don't have a Second Amendment. So that's how important and foundational it is. And then rapid fire, I'm moving to your first question, which was,
what are they going to attack you as?
Oh, yeah, I don't know what they'll. I'm open-minded. I mean, the brown face of white supremacy, right? I've heard some rumblings of that, right?
And that's what we'll go with.
I mean, I've heard it already. It's rumbling up. I don't pay much heed to that because I think that once they've resorted to those kinds of attacks, that's when you know you're right over the target, and I'm staying right over the target.
Do you have time for one more question? Because I think you'll like it.
Last one. Let's
okay,
do it.
Here's my belief on the part of the woke, the transgender competing against women. Leah Thomas, I don't know if you've seen Riley Gaines' speeches recently. I'm of the belief that there's nobody on God's green earth who believes in that policy. I think they push that policy forward to irritate people like us who they consider their opponents and get you to say something that they can frame as being anti-transgender. How do you just completely oppose that policy and not be angry and do it in a compassionate way?
Meticulously is the answer. And I think I don't want to toot my own horn, but I think I did this with Woke Inc. It was really like a book that was mostly unimpeachable by the left, even though it went for a lot of these so-called sacred cows in this neo-progressive woke movement. So the way I've talked about the trans issue is true to my actual belief. I think as an adult, you're free to live whatever life you want, but you're not free to impose that on everybody else, including children in this country. I actually just posted a video on Twitter today. It was my latest tweet, or one of the latest ones that I remember posting today, at least. There was a man, biological man, who's beaten the crap out of a woman in an MMA competition, skull fractures and all, but claims to identify as a woman. We used to call that violence against women when I was growing up. Now we celebrate it as trans rights. This is a mental health epidemic. And what I say is, look, let's get real here. And we'll close with this one, all right? Let's just speak some truth. If you're confused about your gender, especially as a kid, it probably means something else is going wrong in your life. Definitely true. The person who shot people at this Christian school in Nashville, it's a tragedy. Something else is going wrong 99.99% of the time. And yet we now live in a culture where you can't help that kid. You have to pretend like the only thing wrong with them was that they were born into the wrong body. When in fact, what does human compassion and empathy and dignity actually demand? You want to ask that kid, what's going wrong at school? What's going wrong at home? Get to the bottom of it. Help them as a fellow human being. Call it a Christian spirit, call it a Kantian secular spirit, whatever it is, whatever your morals are. Every religious tradition I know wants to empathically help people who are suffering. And people who are bowing to this temple of this trans religion, thinking they're born in the wrong body, that's a mental health condition. We should want to help them. And I think that's something that's beyond refute, beyond debate. And it's the truth of the matter. We've treated this as a mental health condition for most of our history to actually help people. And now we're going out of our way to create gender dysphoria, more suffering in the name of helping people with empathy. We're actually creating more suffering in the world. I think that's how we talk about this issue, because that's the truth of it. And it goes back to this point I made earlier, which is if we're operating from the moral high ground with moral conviction, with first principles, we can take our agenda further than Donald Trump or anybody else ever did. I think it's going to take an outsider to do it, but that's why I'm in this race, not just as an outsider, but as an outsider who, yes, practices what I preach in my own lifestyle. 2 kids at home in a stable 2-family house, 2-parent household, just like the one I grew up in, just like the one we're creating for our kids. Yes, fostering a belief in God. God is not a 4-letter word to us. I think that's what it's going to take that America First agenda to that next level, all the way to the end zone. We began with the football analogy. We don't want to just get into the red zone. We want to get to the end zone with it. And that's what I'm looking to do in this race. And you don't have to vote for me now. You can decide who you want to vote for next year. But if this needs to be part of the conversation, people always ask, how can they be part of the change they want to see? Get me on the debate stage. If you like 70% of what you heard here, if you gave $1 or $5, just like people do this later, just like do it right now. Just go to Vivek2024.com. It's not that hard. Vivek2024.com. Give $1 or $5. we will make this debate this year be about something that we actually define a positive agenda for the country, and that'll be good for the Republican Party. It'll be good for America. That's what I'm hoping to do.
And it'll be fun to see your intellect just eviscerate those dimwits. Just think about the comedy of it, people, to get an actual intelligent intellect person on that stage to debate with these knuckleheads. Thank you so much for being here. This was a great time. I really hope that this helps, and I hope your campaign continues to gather momentum. Thank you very much. We're honored to have you.
I appreciate it. We'll release this as one of the episodes of my podcast series too. This is a great, raw conversation. I love it, guys.
Vivek 2024, guys. Get him on the stage. Enough's enough.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Vivek. Cheers, man.